Hi everyone, continuing. Okay, so we've defined what the real risk-free rate is, and we've defined what the risk-free rate is, which is the rate pegged to a US T-bill, a treasury bill, and everyone calls that the risk-free rate, so we're going to call that R sub RF. We will be using that later, okay? Alright, now over here on an Excel spreadsheet, I've defined what we're building. So far we have R star, which is the real risk-free rate. Now that does not exist, that's an imaginary construct, okay? The T-bill, that is real, so it's going to be R star plus an inflation premium, since T-bills are not immune to inflation, okay? So since people do call that the risk-free rate in the world economy, the US T-bill is considered the safest and most conservative investment you can have. That is going to be call it level 2, okay, of the 5 levels we will build. And I'll elaborate upon that as we go. Okay, now, once we move beyond the T-bill, keeping in mind that the T-bill is current, okay, I forgot to set my timer. Hold on, please. There we are. Okay, now there are other elements of risk that we have to build up on top of that, like making a sandwich, okay? So, now, what if you want to stick with government securities, as I say here, but you want to go out in the long term? All right, the longer you go out in time, like a T-note or a T-bond, those are still U.S. instruments, but they cover a broader span of time. That makes them not quite as safe as a T-bill. Why? Because the longer the time horizon, the less certain you are. And with uncertainty comes more risk, ladies and gentlemen, okay? So when you take on a little more risk for the operation of time, you want to be paid for that if you are a T-bill or a T-bond investor. Therefore, to induce you to invest in a T-note or a T-bond, a longer time horizon, the U.S. government has to sweeten the pie a little bit with a greater interest rate, okay? And we have a name for that. That's called maturity risk. They have to pay you a maturity risk premium, okay? All right. If you have, for example, a 7% bond, I'll get into bonds in chapter 5 or 6. Okay, that means that that bond is going to pay you 7%. You've locked in a nice long-term 7% investment. But the problem is, those fluctuate. And now, several years in the future, you want to take that 7% bond once it matures and you want to reinvest it, and you look around and there are no 7% bonds to be had. There's the maturity risk. The fact that you might have a bond maturing and you look around to find a place to scope around to put it in the market at the same rate and you can't find one. All right, that risk entitles you to a premium right now, okay? So you might be able to find a 7% bond in the future, but to do so you'll have to take on more risk. Remember, the greater the risk you take on, the more of an interest rate you will seek, or a rate of return you will seek on your investment, okay? All right, so for that maturity risk, instead of a T-bill, the short term, let's assume you invest in a 10-year T-bond and you have no idea, no one has any idea where interest rates are going to go. So that uncertainty means you need another premium, not just the inflation premium. You need to add on, you need to tack onto the T-bill an MRP. So I'm going to come down here and I'm going to add an MRP, a maturity risk premium. That's going to be the rate on a longer term T-bond. Okay? All right, it's the same as a T-bill. You're just adding a premium for the uncertainty of time, ladies and gentlemen. Okay? See how we're building an interest rate? Now, we're just dealing with U.S. Treasuries at this point, so we need to go out of that realm and into other dimensions. Okay, like this. Now, the U.S. government is safe. They're not going anywhere. They'll be creditworthy. You can rely upon them to make future payments. But now we're moving into corporates. Now, in the corporate world, I don't care how big, how safe, how secure the company is, there is a risk that the company might fail and be unable to pay you back or make a payment of interest to you. Let's assume you are an investor looking for a rate of return on a bond, okay? Up until now, we've invested in the United States government. Now, what if you invest in General Motors AIG, Enron, all three of those companies, their bonds suffered drastically, and two of them were worse than GM, and one, Enron, is not around anymore, okay? If a company can default, disappear, not pay you back your money, or not pay you your interest, okay, that's a risk. All right, now that's not an issue with U.S. government, but it is a risk with corporates. No matter how big a corporation is, a corporate bond might fail. At one point, I invested in General Motors bonds, and this is in my book, okay? And everyone thought nothing could happen. One person back in the 50s, who I believe was a GM chairperson or president, said, what's good for General Motors is good for America. Okay, that was the height of vanity. The point is, GM in 2008 suffered an incredible 1-2 punch. I used to invest in GM bonds, and one day one of my buddies called me up and said, Alan, you know what? There is a higher cost in a GM car for employee healthcare premiums and benefit premiums than there is for the cost of steel. All right, when he told me that, I looked into it, of course, and I found he was right. And I never invested in GM bonds again. And shortly after that, as solid as GM was, they went through that 2008 debacle, okay? So no matter how solid a company is, if you step outside of the realm of U.S. government securities, you have another element of risk, and we call that a default risk. So you want to be paid, no matter how good the company is, for the highest quality bonds that there are in the corporate world. You want to be paid a default risk premium. So I'm going to take that item right there, duplicate it, and this time I'm going to add plus a default risk premium, a DRP. Okay, and that's going to be the rate on high quality corporate securities. I'm going to call them bonds. Let's stick with bonds. I'm going to differentiate between bonds and stock later on if you don't already know. Okay? Now that's for the best of the best, high quality. Okay? All right, very good. I'm just going to duplicate that and I'll differentiate one more item for you. Okay, now there are some investments, some bond investments that are not high quality. Okay? That means that when you go to sell it, if you want to sell your bond, if you want to sell your General Electric bond, your Coca-Cola bond, your McDonald's bond, you can pick up the phone and sell it without any problem at all. There are some bonds where you can't, however. How about Bob's company down the street? Okay, you might have invested in their bonds, but you might find that the market for them is not as liquid. So if something runs the risk of not being readily disposable when you are ready, it doesn't have liquidity, and you would want to be paid for a less than high quality corporate bond, a liquidity premium. Okay? So for less than high quality investments, you will want an LP. That will be the rate of return on a general investment. Okay, so the rate on I'll call it an average bond investment. I'm sticking with bonds here, okay? Now here's a little summary, folks. Now, something very important, I'm going to want you to be able to take, oh, I forgot to change the terms. I apologize for that. I have to add my liquidity premium. There we are. Okay, now I want you to be able to take any one of these terms using these equations and tell me what the interest rate might be. I might have you back into the IP, I might have you back into the MRP or the DRP or the risk-free rate of return, the real risk-free rate of return. I need you to know all 5 of these cold, okay? But friends, this is how interest rates are built, and I hope that makes sense to you. Okay, I will save that. Okay. So there's our general equation, ladies and gentlemen. The real risk-free rate plus an inflation premium plus a maturity risk premium plus a default risk premium and a liquidity premium equals the rate of return that you would expect to receive on a general less than high quality investment. Okay? More on bonds in a future chapter. All right, now I take three of these elements, specifically these three, friends, okay, a long-term T-bond, and I constructed this. Now this is called a yield curve. If any of you have experience in banking, you know what this is, okay? As of 2005, this is what a yield curve looks like. We take the time and put it on the that's the x-axis, I apologize to you. And I take the rate of interest, the yield, hold on please. Okay, I apologize, I had a phone call there. Let's resume. That's the yield curve. Okay, so on the x-axis we have time, and on the y-axis we have the yield percent. Now as you see, in banking or in lending, whatever you're doing, I don't care whether you're investing or whether you're the one borrowing, either way, generally the yield curve slopes up like that. It goes up steeply in the shorter term, and then it levels off, it tops out. Now, I'm going to explain why that happens, but I'm going to do it from a numerical point of view, okay? But suffice it to say that that yield curve, our yield curve in the United States, generally looks like this. Now, sometimes it's shallower than others. Right now, it's probably much shallower than that. But usually it's steep, it curves upward in the early years. Why is that? Because I'm going to isolate these three factors down here. The real risk-free rate, an inflation premium, and the MRP. We're going to make this a T-bond investment. Okay? Now, we know that inflation, it's reasonably easy to predict in the short term, but it is harder in the longer term. And on top of that, we have a maturity risk premium, which follows time. The longer out in time you go, the higher the rate will be. So that's why the yield curve looks like this. And again, I'll show you the construction of this in a moment. Okay? Once in a great while in history, the curve slopes down. That happens during periods of very, very, very high inflation, when everybody knows that the inflation will be corrected. Okay? I'll demonstrate both of those concepts to you in a moment. Okay? So keep that curve in mind. I'm going to explain why it looks like that. Okay. Basically, it's because of time on the x-axis. So usually that yield curve is going to be upward sloping, and then it will flatten out. Why? Because when you get too many years out, no one knows what the heck's going to happen. Okay? So we can have suspicion about what will happen in the short term and in the moderate term, but in the long term, really nobody knows. So there's going to be a smoothing out, and that's why the curve looks like that. So what I did is I threw out these numbers for you. These are all my invention, okay? So I went out from 1 year to 25 years. I assumed the real risk-free rate was 1.5%. Then I added an inflation premium. Now that's going to increase, but it's going to increase less and less and less as we go out in time because, again, nobody knows. I subtotaled it for you. Then I added a maturity premium, as you can see, because with more time comes more risk. But I also made that flatten out a tiny bit too. So the total rate I'm going to put in my curve, you see in the far right column here. Again, these are all my numbers. Notice they all start with the same real risk-free rate. So they contain that, they contain inflation, they contain a maturity premium. Only three. What's that? That's this. That's the rate on a long-term T-bond. There is no DRP, there is no LP. Okay, we're sticking with line 22 here. Okay, let me save that for you. Don't want to lose that. All right, to the next slide. Okay, so our interest rate is going to be stacked. Okay, I'm going to give it to you with colors. And again, there is no default or liquidity risk at all. It's going to look like this, friends. Now, the red line represents the real risk-free rate. This is all in the book. Okay, you can find all of this on page, what page are we on? 60. The green line is the yield curve, okay? So the red and the blue under it show you how that green line is created. The real risk-free rate at any point is going to be 1.5. Then we stack on inflation, but of course we don't know what inflation will be way out, so it smooths out. The maturity risk, also a function of time, starts off low and then goes up and then tails out, okay? Because again, with more time comes more risk. So if you just erase those other lines and look at the green line, That is why the yield curve looks like it does. Finally, in the late 70s and early 80s, the yield curve inverted. Why? Because inflation was incredibly drastically high. Everyone knew it couldn't stay that way, but in the short term, it was there. It was what it was. So I did the same curve for you, friends, with the real risk-free rate staying where it is. Inflation, I dropped. You will notice everyone said inflation can't stay where it is. Subtotal, maturity premium, I kept the same. So the only thing I changed in this scenario, guys, is the inflation premium, which is going to decelerate. Now watch what happens when I plot these on a curve. There it is. Again, this is all in the book. Now you'll notice the red line stays the same. Here's an important thing. The green line continues to grow because, again, with more time comes more uncertainty. The only thing that really drastically changes is the blue line. Now instead of going up, it's coming down because people knew that inflation was not sustainable where it was in the late 70s. Okay? So when you stack these and add them all up, you see that the green line indicates a downward sloping yield curve. That's how the yield curve works, specifically on a long-term U.S. bond. Okay? That brings us to the end of the chapter. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to post a couple of assignments I would like you to do in Chapter 3. I've already given you Chapter 2. I'm going to post homework files, probably a couple of them because I've got a lot to cover. So be watching for those, and again, don't watch the files until you give the homework a real try, okay? That is all for now, and thank you for your kind attention, and have yourself a good rest of your Friday. Take care.